Delicate subject. Chapter 47. Jane. Once she had determined her environment, she began to use it to her advantage. Some of the things that had led her into panicked quagmire led her out. Garrus's face, his eyes, the way he leaned toward her, the way he wanted to tell her every moment but didn't, because he was convinced it was for her benefit, not his. His face and voice had warned her as he always had on any battlefield, given her a heads up, always having her six. Some of her behavior beforehand gave her a perfect transition set up. She'd been smiling and accepting of the loss of her arm. It could transition into smiling acceptance of restrictions and focus on healing. She had new perceptions, new capacity to explore, and looking and listening to things had new weight and meaning. She could be forgiven for distraction and contemplation. Once past the stage of her immediate wrath, she was better able to form and stick to a strategy. Nobody confronted her on her probing into limitations of information, so there was with most people an expectation of her ignorance, and she could hide in their compassion and indulgence. Thane knew better, but she and he knew the space of détente and were comfortable there, both watching and waiting. Because of Garrus, she was behind cover and knew the direction of the enemy. She would not be blindsided entirely. She stayed behind that cover on his orders. In command, you made choices, and he had made his. He was struggling with the consequences. She did not ask more of him, did not question his choices, and transparently loved the man. Oddly enough, but not unexpected, that added more guilt to his flavor of regret. And there wasn't much she could do about that but relieve it with her body, give him moments where he felt cherished. He would hold her down, hold her in place, every hard, unyielding plane and thrust of his body, every growl that sounded with more passion than she had heard before her new perceptions speaking to her. More growling and fewer words. More of the sound of her name in his richer voice and deeper sub-vocals. He did not call her Karim as often. Karim to him in his mind was linked to following her inspiration, and he knew at this moment he was without her eclipsed light, possibly believed he would not have it again. If she was watching him when he woke, she saw him have to come to terms with the demands of the day in lightning flash stages, his eyes moving from contentment of his body in hers, through to realization, through to that horrible choked restraint that only loosed temporarily for him. When she told him he had permission to be happy, to find peace in his choices through word or deed or physical welcome. Garrus could not fully grasp or predict her forgiveness or the strategic value of her compliance, not as Thane could. Garrus thought about what he believed he deserved. Thane thought of natures and inevitabilities of character. Garrus could not accept that he deserved to touch her, or let go of the fear that it might be his last time, driving the imprint of his body deep into hers. She imagined that Garrus felt unworthy to touch her, that his sense of honor, in fact, would drive him to hold himself back from her physically. But there would have been no way to explain that. In his unguarded moments he was guilty and flayed. He had few unguarded moments. And she saw him get better at lying daily, but never better at accepting that he could or should do it. He wanted to tell her, and couldn't. Unable to tell her, he wanted to assume the distance he believed the lie would cause, but couldn't. He was aware constantly of that barrier, resisted being close out of guilt. Then when she made clear she would accept no distance, He sought his apology and forgiveness in her body, and she granted it, sins seen and unseen. She had some peace in knowing the outcome. He had the churning horror of command, but he had her, whether he knew it or not. Once command was passed, she would be sure he knew that she understood and backed his choices, as he always had hers, no matter the cost. She had shut Garrus out of her own decisions when in command. She understood, and she did empathize. She strove to see the window rather than the mirror, to see him as he was and comfort him, which she could always do with her fingertips on his hide, her mouth on his, her body open and hungry, her heart beating for him. Only her mind, as his, clouded for the best of reasons. Thane was so much easier. His silences, how she and he managed to tell each other in veiled words and osmosis. Some equilibrium reached with backs turned and eyes closed, fingers entwined and spirits whispering to each other. Reverie gave them all, in their separate, necessary and chosen locations, unity, release, and refuge. She and Thane conspired to draw Garrus out of his head, into communion, and once there, he would allow only their one necessary circumstance to keep them separate, demanding bond in all other ways. She believed Garrus to be under venom bond, either literally or with Thane's iron control and clarity guiding him through the darkness. A vow or a promise had been made by one or both of them. Under reverie or tyranny, Garrus did not confess or break. She could only hope that Thane was also reinforcing to Garrus that Jane would not forsake him. Garrus would have to grow to believe that with the certainty that Thane had. In the face of Thane's certainty, despite Garrus's reservations, she grew to believe that even if their choice was not the right choice, it was a choice with reasons, with the intent to conserve and not destroy. She did not know all the reasons, but she would. Thane would tell her. But she believed she already knew. She also believed that Thane had convinced Garrus that regardless of her response, the choice must be made. So she must guard her own choices and responses. She practiced team and trust. Her nails did dig in deeper, each touch and word choreographed from all of them. Less spontaneity, but not less love. Care in the fullest extent of the word. Artful, thoughtful, passionate. A pattern emerged, Garrus gone except for 6 hours a day, 2 awake with them and 4 asleep. She carefully did not question a workload that resulted in that schedule, and did not press him that he looked and sounded haggard, as he had on Omega. Thane was no longer by her side during her time in the Midbay constantly, that time theoretically spent with Garrus in planning and execution. She had made a comment about Thane getting back to his habit of exercise and meditation. He had given her a look that probed 1 moment longer than necessary, and then agreed that was the case. Thane was with her when she slept, when she woke, when she ate, when she retired to her cabin. Which she did, no more walking the ship. She tried to avoid temptation. She had reintroduced herself to everyone, but she was polite and reassuring, casual and kind. She had determined there were weak spots if she wanted to press. She could press on Jack, who had no respect for authority, had never formed a bond with Garrus or Thane to the extent that she had with Shepard. Jack would want to be a rebel with the answers. This would be Jack's moment to be a pirate, knowing more than Shepard, wanting to prove it, wanting to earn a favor and feed her own badass ego. Jack would want to tell her. She could open Jack with a sharp, merciless puncture and twist like a can opener, and information would pour out. All she wanted. A stroke to Jack's ego, a flash of vulnerability in Jane's eyes, perhaps a whiff of fear, and Jack would be unable to resist. She'd say, "Let me tell you, Shepard, I don't think you're as stupid as they think you are. I knew you'd figure it out. Here's what you need to know." She restrained herself. David would have been another path, even Legion. Both could have been convinced or even tricked into confirming what she already knew. She doubted anybody had considered that the media blackout would make her think she was indoctrinated. She could wedge that horror into a surprised mind and watch what leaked out. "Legion, help me. I'm concerned that the ship has been indoctrinated. Nothing explains what I'm seeing. I need you to help me get passage to Omega." If she applied the right dose of controlled panic and impulsive resolve, requiring immediate reassurance with the threat of immediate flight, he would logically explain, considering that the better path. "David, I believe Reapers are invading and that the crew is attempting to conceal that from me for my own good, to ensure my recovery. I understand. I don't want to shatter that illusion. I wish for everyone else to remain calm. Please, help me. The distress of helplessness is greater than the distress of being of use. I know you can understand that. You can monitor my vitals, ensure that no information is causing me deeper stress than the ignorance. Please." All of those things would work. She could chip down most people in her crew with the same method in different doses and variations. She doubted that Thane had convinced or even approached everyone on the ship, considering his tactical knowledge and communication itself being a huge risk to security. She could start cornering maintenance crew and start any number of flattering, misleading conversations that would make individuals want to help Commander Shepard in her noble fight against infirmity and the Reapers at once. But she wouldn't. Having a strategy and some cover eased her sense of helplessness and breathlessness. She was reassured that her instincts were still functioning, and she settled into a stalking pose, silent and suppressing the fact that her whiskers were twitching and her eyes sharp. She glided through instead with charm, humor, feigned humility, and just enough ignorance to be believable, to not make Garrus put his hands on his finally catching on hips and say, "Come on now, what the hell? There's no way you don't care about that." Or catching Thane's sharp eye with a maladroit portrayal of innocence. He knew better if nobody else did. Jane did not attempt to access terminals any longer, and she put data requests strictly through Karen. Jane had apologetically stated that she required some self-discipline to break the habit of command, so Jane asked Karen occasional but regular questions about what was or was not possible to research or contemplate, accepting limits with a careful balance of grace and impatience. Jane submitted a carefully considered list of questions each day. Some she knew would be approved, some she knew would be denied. That way, Karen, who was wise but medically inclined and not as accustomed to Jane's psychological parsing as Thane was, would report back to the team that she believed Jane was recovering, was impatient but trying to be disciplined. Accent on discipline, guys. Karen, make sure you make a note of that. Everyone knows I'm impatient. It's the discipline that needs reinforcement, and you can provide that. Jane asked David to provide her with a datapad that had the capacity to play Pawn Aoife matches. She played a great deal. The stylized moves gave clarity to her thoughts, reminding her that each move ideally had a short-term and a long-term purpose. She could win when it wasn't against Thane. She played Pawn Aoife with Thane as well, and he still kicked her anatomy all over the board. More fuel for her feigned and real humility against circumstance. She was focused and in strategic high gear. Much of her rage burned off, but remained focused on Reapers. No rage remained for Garrus. Only her Russian hope to reassure him that would have to wait. She had only respect and smiles that did not reach her lips, but did reach her kiss for Thane. She was observing her environment with new acuity, waiting for the final moves of this match to play out. She contemplated first moves when the board was set again and observed the lessons of what Reapers and her mission on Sakesh had wrought. It wasn't all wreckage. Morden was convinced that the genophage would be cured, and soon. A matter of days or weeks. She reached out to Morden and thanked him for his work. He congratulated her on her mission and expressed interest in seeing her new arm in action. She convinced Morden to allow her to be present if he made that final determination of definitive cure. She wished to speak to all the Krogan before they left Eurydice, whether or not her command was restored. He agreed he would comply. Her new arm would come today. 3 weeks since her injury, nerve pathways healed and solidified, given time to recover from trauma so they would not be over or under-sensitized. Garrus and Thane would be there for the unveiling. Or the on-sticking? Unveiling sounded more poetic. She was attempting to be poetic and not prosaic. Thane had insisted on collecting Garrus and breakfast, and she played pocket Ponifa. They would go together to the medbay, and she'd get her new, highly hyped technological wonder arm. She missed having 2 hands. She was looking forward to it, one more step to autonomy and aim. Any step forward was a relief, and this meant she was getting closer. Restraint to her command was easing. Excuses to protect her so completely fading. Garrus and Thane arrived together with food, quiet. One of the greater challenges between them was casual conversation, because each of them individually knew that so many topics could set off dismay and pain in Garrus, pain in herself, suspicion from Thane that her responses were not due only to trauma but to calculation. They were all watching and watched so closely. Humor was a luxury she mostly did without due to caution. Garrus did without due to stress, and Thane did without because his humor was so dark in conception and execution that it was misplaced. She didn't want to discuss general ship or outside-the-ship news or strategy. She didn't want to put Garrus through that, so she chose to consider her new arm. Still a painful subject, but otherwise they were all going to stare at their breakfast while eating. Not awkwardly. They were all too sophisticated for that. Garrus had siege mentality at this point, and after 3 weeks, shock and pain over personal injury had faded, but she imagined he knew how many lives had been lost, cumulatively as he sat calmly over a casual meal. She was marking time. Thane was marking her. Garrus was enduring. The practical truth was that doing things with one arm was difficult and frustrating. Thane watched her and learned the things that irritated her and what did not. Food arrived in bite-sized pieces and with the plate secured to the table with subtle suction so she did not have to chase food or a skidden plate. Jars and containers were left loose so she could manage them with one hand. Thane helped her bathe, he helped her dress, always helped her undress, and she was grateful for his insistence and presence, making everything more difficult and easier in turns. Both absolutely necessary. Thane had redone her fingernails, a deep red with gold filigree tracing of pattern, something beautiful. After smiling, kissing them both, and taking her first bite of breakfast, she said, "Now my nails won't match." Garrus smiled. Thane said, "Yes, they will." "You painted the nails of my new hand?" Thane nodded and said, "Yes," in a tone that meant, "Of course." She asked, "Why red and gold?" It appears throughout history. Red has been the most common color of human adornment. Lips, cheeks, nails. Your color on our wrists is red. It seems as though all races of humanity have discovered it will always go with their skin, as their skin all carries the same color underneath. Something unifying, undeniable of the nature of being human. Something just below all surfaces. Garrus raised a brow. And the gold? Gold was rare on Earth, and does not react to oxygen, which will corrode most things. Jane looked as she had before at the small pattern in gold repeated precisely across her nails. And the symbol? A drill folk charm, intended as a hope for healing. Thank you. I'll add my hope for healing, Garrus said solemnly. And mine. Thus they all skimmed the surfaces, did not delve into the blue or green or red, did not get under each other's skin, tried to make each touch a caress. They all seemed to accept that the difficult task of finding something to talk about that wouldn't result in explosion or implosion was accomplished, and they ate in silence. Command was weighing heavily on Garrus, but it looked good on him to her eyes. Granted, she had new eyes, new ears, and was currently trying to cultivate a new physical brain, a team mindset, and under all that was the razor-edge desperation to get her command back. He was an obstacle, technically. He was an excellent, well-thought-out obstacle with a Pawn-Efa master guiding him. It was the first time she'd looked at Garrus in an intellectual and strategic match, and thought she could not beat him. Thought she did not want to beat him. Thought she needed to wait until he gave way of his own accord. She really did not know if that was exhaustion or wisdom, but she could read the board. He was the personification of inevitability playing out. She smiled at them as she stood to go. She imagined under normal circumstances, Garrus would sweep her into his arms despite any protest and carry her to the medbay. But she got smiles from her men back, and silence, sedate and hopeful companions. Her new arm was a beautiful thing, indistinguishable from her original hand in appearance, and distinct in now likely becoming her dominant hand based on the control and range possible. She was a fiddler crab. If they could do it, she could do it. She was run through a few tests by Miranda and Karen, but they had stopped running neurological tests constantly, and that was a good sign. She didn't have an Omni-tool yet, but also no being told she would not be getting one. All steps forward. She likely did not properly appreciate Miranda's genius and the fact that she knew Jane's body so well. The hand worked immediately. Very odd to be using the left for complicated tasks. But she was doing that within a few hours of fitting. No special treatment or care needed. The arm would be seamless, indistinguishable, and would likely not need to be removed unless severe damage occurred, just assessed at regular physical examinations once all initial adjustments were made. She watched the foreign fingers that looked like her fingers, open and closed, imagined them as the articulated extensions of a reaper for some odd reason. Then that image brought her to Sovereign crouched over the citadel and locking on, then the arms of the citadel closing. 5 wings instead of 5 reaper extensions. Citadel. The place that the conduit led, there was kept secret. The place kept secret by keepers. A figurative and perhaps literal trap. Mysteries still intact. She stared at her hand, any sound around her blanked out by a light buzzing in her ears. The Citadel. She'd always hated the place, but what if that hatred was earned? What if her intuition... Legion's words rang in her head. If David were to draw a map of a ward on the Citadel, in human speech he would be unable to label the constructs as those on the Citadel label them, and a drawing would be inadequate, unable to provide dimension. The Citadel's dimensions. She flashed back through charbands, scanning of the keepers. She still had that information. She had David. She moved her fingers, brain loosing from chilled, practiced immobility into what passed for certainty. The Reapers were invading. She knew it. The Citadel was the catalyst. She knew it. She closed her hand into a fist and looked back up at Karen, buzzing, fading. Her interlude unnoticed other than as an appreciation of a new tool, restoration of function. That it was. Now she had to prove it. Rehab flew by, her mind finally engaged on a solution. After being run through her paces, her mind working on 2 tracks, appreciating her new arm and chewing on the problem and solution of the Citadel being the key and catalyst, Garrus challenged her. Karen said you could beat Rex at arm wrestling. That's still true? Karen nodded. Sufficient reinforcement of the structure of her left shoulder and bone was the main issue. She should be able to beat Rex. So how about me? You want to know if I can beat you at arm wrestling? Well, we don't want to embarrass Rex in front of his women. I'd like a demonstration, though. Jane looked at Karen, who nodded. I was concerned that you would not be able to grasp the relative range of strength in your arm and hand, but Miranda managed to scale it in such a way that it works not in tandem with your right arm, but along a differently defined spectrum, new input to your brain. Considering most bodies work along symmetrical equality, Miranda is, again, a genius. Otherwise, I'd be concerned she'd crush your hand, but she has sufficient control. Why not? Jane felt, for the first time in weeks, all-powerful and invincible, at least regarding her left arm and her intuition. She'd get her ship back. Her hands would be stronger on the helm, and her mind was... Shepard. She was still Shepard. She and Garrus moved to a table, clearing it of a few breakables, and they set up elbows, did the inevitable trash-talking. Garrus looked happy. Maybe the easing of command he saw in her potential was good for all of them. She raised one brow. You sure about this? Let me know if it hurts too much. Put your money where your mouth is. You want that raise again? You're gonna have to earn it. What do I get if I win? He swept his free hand around and said, This ship and everyone on it. She pretended to consider. You too? Her heart leapt for a moment, the first confirmation of return to command. Not today, she knew, not with a new hand and no omni-tool and no proficiency testing, but bless him for saying so. He'd give it to her today if he could. Thane smiled. No alarm. Karen and Miranda were casually entertained. No alarm. He tilted his head and said with the teasing warmth she hadn't seen in his face or heard in his voice, unforced, for too long. I'll insist. She adjusted her hand and grasped his, not too hard, not too soft, along that sliding scale. She knew how much he could take, lots of practice with her strength against his. Her mind knew what effort, and she did not have to think about it. Distinct from her other arm. Let me know if I'm about to crack your plate. I'll back off. She had a light grip that she tightened until his smile faded to surprise, and then resolved into a new smile of appreciation. She did not crack his plate, but she did have his hand flat to the table in an easy sweep. Through his hand she felt command pass back to her, hale and healed, laughing and sure. Now she just needed to wait for the rest of the ship to catch up to his certainty. Garrus squeezed her hand, laughed, and bowed his head. For my part, Karim, this ship and everyone on it is yours. He leaned forward and pressed his crest to her forehead, then turned and said, You want to give it a try, Thane? Jane has made a previous promise to not use that hand against me. Why didn't I think of that? Now if I asked, it would sound like I'm copying. Thane smiled at Jane and said, Some moves are worthy of copying. Jane had gained some ground and was intent on gaining more. After successful installation of her arm, she was asked to test it out in the real world. Garrus and Thane stayed with her until lunch, and then they broke off to get work done. She was heartened and able to get her own work done. Her arm right now was not something she needed to worry about, and despite medical admonition, she did not stay long in the real world. She moved into the interface pod. She pulled up all the information in her archives about Chorban's scanning of the Keepers, and relaxed that this information was not restricted. She thought, and then contacted David. She told him, David, I'm aware I am not in command. None of the things I am asking for are commands. Please feel free to refuse, or pass on my request to Commander Vakarian. Of course, Commander Shepard. He had never stopped calling her that, and she didn't ask him to. Congratulations on the integration of your new arm. It appears to be functional. I wish you luck on your proficiency testing, and I anticipate swift return to command. Thank you. What I'm asking is relevant to my return to command, but for now is only research and prep work. I have some data stored in my personal files that has not been integrated into the SR2, information I received while I was on the SR1 and did not consider significant. My interest is in the Citadel. I suspect that based on Keeper involvement and some of the way the Citadel works, there are parts of the Citadel that have not been accessed or mapped. Is that correct? That is correct. All right. I'd like to release this information to you. In anticipation of my return to command, I believe the Citadel to be the catalyst. I believe you are my best bet to communicate with the Keepers, with the ultimate goal of mapping the entirety of the Citadel and synthesizing how it is that the Catalyst and Crucible work together. I will be doing nothing but some reading about the history of the Citadel, and of course my work will be quickly eclipsed by yours, but I will not stress myself. My focus is on my recovery. I have forwarded a working model of the Citadel based on research and exploration done. There are several unexplored areas, well documented. You have immediate access to what is known historically about the Citadel based on this cycle's explorations and accounts from Prothean habitation. Thank you. Don't answer if you feel I do not have clearance, but please prepare an answer for my return to command if you cannot give it now. How complete is the Crucible at this moment, and how long until it is complete? It is appropriate to inform you. The Crucible is continuing construction. It is 72% complete, and it should likely be complete in 6 weeks. So she had 6 weeks to put the two together. It was too long, too many lives lost, and too short. Her life might be over in 6 weeks. Thank you, David. I am grateful to be your friend. I am blessed to have you on the ship with me. I will do as you ask, Commander Shepard. You have my wishes for your full recovery, restoration of command, and gratitude as well for friendship and presence. 6 weeks. 6 weeks of ignoring the Reapers and focusing on the Citadel, on no proof. She felt the air bleed out of her slowly, her surge forward with regaining her hand suddenly dragged down by what lay ahead. David, will you please update my internal appearance to match my new arm? An update according to nail art. Thane has been creative. Of course. It is done. That is a fascinating symbol. Do you know its history? Jane looked down at her hands, turning her nails. Thane said it was a folk symbol for healing. Historically, disease and drought plagued the Drell people, limiting population growth. When a plague and a drought coincided, it could be lethal to an entire clan. This symbol is from a clan that suffered such a setback, losing so many of their people that their clan leader converted to the priesthood of Arashu. He set this symbol on the skin of his people, pledging his life to her, asking her to watch over those who carried this mark on their skin. His children died, all but his youngest son, an infant. His wife died shortly after childbirth. The tribe was decimated, but the Drell, having dedicated his life to the priesthood, went into seclusion after travel to a nearby clan that took him in. His son lived, and the clan continued on in his son's name. He wore that symbol on his skin and passed it on to his children. The symbol became a charm against misfortune, in use by Drell before the diaspora. What was the name of that clan? Tualon. Unfortunately, none remain of that name, the last descendants having recently died.